virtual reality games too expensive? If you've got a VR headset and you've started to get into VR gaming, you will have found very quickly that the price of VR games, even incredibly simplistic VR games, tends to be rather high compared to what you'd generally expect from a similar sort of game in 2D or a non-VR form of game. Now, developers will say and explain the reason why their title is more expensive than their 2D equivalent is simply because of economics, in that only 4 people have VR headsets, and so in order to pay for the development cost of their game, the price needs to be high to recuperate the development value. If there was more of a market there, they would be able to sell the game for less because more sales could come in, which would equate to more money at the end of the day for the developer. Now, I think most consumers of VR games and most people that have spent £750 on a VR headset and have fast computers and are invested in VR, I think they understand this. I don't think they're ignorant of the fact that there's not that many people with VR headsets and that VR developers need to pay for the development of their games. I think where the problem really lies is that you have AAA quality titles in VR, some titles in VR that are high quality, and I don't think anyone would argue it, but there's just no playtime in them. So regardless of if a consumer agrees, first of all, that I'm happy to pay more for this because it's a limited audience and I'm into VR and I want to, they're happy with that. Regardless of that, there's still going to be the simple fact, the basic fact that spending £40, £35 on something that's going to give 45 minutes of entertainment just isn't a good proposition for your average consumer, regardless of how into VR they are or how good that 45-minute experience is. It just doesn't make sense. I also definitely think that we've seen some incredibly high quality VR titles in terms of the actual polish and the graphical delivery and the stability of the titles, but then when it comes to the actual depth of the game mechanics, they're often really lacking. And the thing is, it's not the fault of the developers. But being realistic here, it's bloody hard to build computer games in the first place. It's even harder to make good computer games that play well, work well and don't have problems. And then you've got the factor of virtual reality and motion control. So it's layer upon layer of difficulty from a development standpoint to make these to make actual rich gameplay experiences. So I'm not having a go at developers. It's a very difficult problem to approach. But what I'm pointing out is that you can see from a consumer perspective, as there's been a lot of these titles that may look nice, but they just don't offer the playtime or the gameplay complexity, that why a lot of consumers are then reluctant to spend money on VR titles. And I think it's all very well to say, these are VR games, it's a different genre, it's a different entity to 2D games, it's a different platform, but the fact is they're still games, they're still digital entertainment products. And as we saw with arcade games in the 90s, what happened was they got more and more complex. It started getting more and more elaborate arcade machines with booths you sit in, motorbikes you ride and things, and the movement was away from the actual addictive core mechanics and more into polish of the overall arcade experience. And obviously consumers just went, well, a pound for 5 minutes of gameplay, it doesn't make sense. It's just stupid. Like, sure, it's shiny, it's a really nice different experience, but I think most people would rather pay 20p but get something that at its core has very tight and addictive game mechanics. That's why people are playing a game over another activity. It's the sort of addictive, tight, rewarding core aspects of what you get from games that you don't get from other activities. Taking from that, aside from the fact that obviously consumers, where possible, want to spend less money, it's a case, I think, of how can developers add value to their games at minimum cost. And there are certain things that VR offers that developers can exploit, which adds value at very low cost. I think the first one, and one that I don't really see discussed that much, is the fact that VR headsets all have microphones on them, which allows you, if you have a multiplayer based game, to exploit the fact that people are generally social and will talk to each other. Now, anyone that's played a lot of VR games will have started to probably have found themselves gravitating towards games like Onwards, Rec Room, or even when playing games like Pool Nation. The fact is, you spend 40, 50, 60% of the time chatting to the other person in the game and socialising, not really actually interacting with the game. So the developer of that game are really capitalising on the sort of social equity that players bring to the title themselves, rather than the developer having to spend time bashing everything out themselves. It's a sort of new form of user-generated content. It's just social content. And I think developers that really exploit that social aspect of content from having a microphone on headsets and everyone being able to just talk to each other, developers that exploit that will see that their titles do better than others that don't, because it adds an extreme amount of replayability and extreme amount of value to the titles, without the developer having to necessarily do a lot of work, especially relative to other features that would give a similar amount of playtime that you get from having social mechanics. Now, you wonder why Facebook are interested in virtual reality, and I think you'll see this social theme, even not in a case of joining, adding friends and what have you and all that business, but just the aspect of how humans interact when they're actually in front of each other, or perceived to be in front of each other, and the emergent social properties that come from that, I think is going to be a theme of VR moving into the future. That developers that exploit that will do better, and also be able to exploit it at lower cost than trying to develop mechanics or the general packaging or the construct that you would generally associate with a 2D game, or what would generally be expected of a AAA 2D title. I think another thing developers can do is, especially now that we have motion controllers on all platforms, is exploit those motion controllers in original ways with mechanics that no one's seen before. And there's actually, I think, an interesting case study between something like Climby, and I think there's a candy-based climbing game as well. I think it's called Candy Climb. But that and the Climb by Crytek for the Oculus Rift. Now, if you look at those games, they both do a sort of climbing mechanic. They're completely different games. Climby compared to The Climb are completely different games in some ways, but they both essentially execute that sensation of climbing. Now, the difference is Climby is very minimal in its graphics presentation, whereas Crytek's The Climb has gone for a very literal execution and sort of almost simulatory appearance of its game. And you can obviously, Climby could be developed by one or two people quite easily, and as a result its development cost will be a lot lower than The Climb, which I believe had a team of at least 7 people working on it. I'm not sure the exact numbers, but even if they had a smaller team working on The Climb, the amount of artistic talent and the amount of work and execution and polish that goes into producing a title like The Climb is just on a completely different level to something like Climby. But the point is, from a consumer perspective, from the player's perspective of the game mechanics, what they're interacting with, and which you can get more time out of, Climby, probably for more people, for the vast majority of consumers, offers more gameplay value. And I think The Climb is still retailing for £40. It is a fantastic game. I think it's well worth the £40 of titles that are polished, and you still get your value for money. The Climb is probably one of the top ones there, but The Climb is £40, and Climby is on Steam at the moment for something like £7. Now, obviously, there's a visual appeal to The Climb, and as I say, it's incredibly impressive what they've done with it. But the point is, there's no reason why a climbing game and the mechanics of climbing can't be executed from a developer's perspective and sold at a lower price, and have something that potentially I could see people playing Climby for the next five plus years. Whereas with The Climb, I think it'll be you know, people will move on from it. It'll be more of the traditional play it for a couple of months, drop it, wait for the next one to come out. The general theme I'm getting across though is that I think, although there's that urge to do the sort of AAA polished title and with that the AAA polished visuals, the reality is that you don't need that AAA polished visuals, and players really at the core would rather not have those visuals, pay less, and get something that just gets straight to the gameplay, or maybe offers some type of unique implementation of game mechanics that use and exploit the intrinsic unique properties of VR, especially VR motion controllers. So I don't want this video to go on too long because we've already gone on way too long. Oh dear, I'm sorry guys. I hope it's not being boring. But the main thing here is, and the initial question was, are VR games too expensive? And I actually think a lot of VR games are too expensive. I think that, you know, the developers aren't lying. They've had to make their games expensive because they've developed certain types of title that are expensive to develop, so they've got to recuperate the cost. I think the key lesson and the key thing to do is that developers need to be really clever about the type of game they develop and the cost they incur in the development, so that they don't have to then sell the games at a high price to recuperate those costs. Because as I say, it's of course really simple to come up with completely unique ideas, fully understand how to utilize motion controllers and VR in cost-effective ways. It's totally intuitive. If you're a developer struggling, just send me an email. I've got plenty of ideas. I'm sure they'll make you broke within a week. But the point is, yes, games, I think a lot of VR games are too expensive. I don't blame the developers. I can understand why. Well, they're not too expensive. I can understand why players are reluctant to spend those prices on those expensive VR titles, is probably a better way of putting it. But as we pointed out, I think you're starting to see that there are more affordable VR games coming out. I think there'll be trends in the development of certain types of VR games, and probably for another video, we can talk about how funding and the bootstrapping from people like Facebook and some of the stuff that Valve's done, and some of the other publishers out there that are helping to fund the development of certain titles, how that isn't always a terrible thing and where that makes sense. But that'll be for another video. So there you go. As I say, I hope that was entertaining. Sorry, went off meandering a bit there. Are VR games too expensive? Question not answered properly, but probably as best as I could answer it. If you enjoyed the video though, please click the subscribe button, like us, check out our other videos, and let me know in the comments. Actually, for this type of video, it'd be really interesting to actually have an interesting conversation in the comments, and we can do follow-ups on it. Hopefully we can have some intellectual people, you know, minimise the amount of penis jokes and your mum jokes. But, you know, it's YouTube comments. My audience isn't too bad, actually. Thank you guys that watch my channel that are actually not completely ridiculously immature. Most people that comment on Game Muscle videos are actually quite nice people, which is refreshing. Maybe it's because we've only got 3 viewers. We'll just have to keep things small and simple. Everyone can learn from that. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and like. I'll see you in the next video we do. Until then, goodbye.